It's the Innovation Podcast with Mark Reed Edwards and Garnet Harriman. Let's start the show.
It's Mark, back this week with part 2 of our chat with Lane Jost of PwC. Garnet and I probed more about the investment possibilities in opportunity zones and the political, social, and economic effects. Let's get back into the discussion.
So the second thing I wanted to go back to that Lane dropped earlier was about this notion of the permitted investments. So this is clearly a real estate investment tool on the one hand. You know, there are requirements in the opportunity zone about, you know, what you can buy, where you can buy it, hence zone, right? I mean, where you can buy it. And then there are requirements about how much you have to improve it, right? So that's the other big thing. You're improving the quality of the, you know, housing inventory in a direction that's up and not down. And so that's good. But then there's this whole other category of permitted investments that's possibly, Lane and Mark, possibly, and Peter, if you're out there listening, Peter Stewart, it's possibly the single vaguest part of the entire vague litigation legislation. You know, and
That was a slip of the tongue.
Yeah, exactly right. well, that would be a Freudian slip because, you know, everyone, and it's worth digressing on that one a little bit because everyone who has money to spend in an opportunity zone structure is deeply concerned about making a misstep about where the money can go and how you put it to work, because the IRS is, you know, literally defining this on the fly, right? They're holding a series of essentially town halls and then, you know, feedback sessions and all this kind, and they're taking into consideration a lot of things that can be changed. One of them is, you know, the parameters around, quote, permitted investment. So back to the second category of permitted investments, it's enterprises. And that's literally all it says, right? So I approach this from the standpoint of 25 years of putting money into, like, you know, small private companies that hopefully become much bigger and, God willing, public, and everybody makes a boatload of money along the way, right? That's my perspective. And I'm struggling even now, months into this, actually maybe a year into this, to try to understand what actually is permitted about the enterprises and how that translates into an actually actionable investment strategy. And we've had a few epiphanies, like very minor insights along the way, that despite how small these insights are, they're still like light years ahead of where we believe other potential investors are in the opportunity zone space. If you don't mind, I'll just I'll expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, go ahead.
So there's this major requirement about the enterprise investment category within opportunity zones. And it says that basically for it to be a permitted enterprise investment, the enterprise itself has to be located in the enterprise zone. So that's cool, whatever, that makes sense. And then the enterprise itself has to derive more than 50% of its revenues from the opportunity zone itself. Mm-hmm. Now that's interesting because, you know, a lot of these places, think about it, right? Go back to the raison d'etre of the opportunity zone. It's because there aren't that many great places to live, affordable places to live. It's because the zone has been underserved historically by things like banks. So, you know, it stands to reason that there's a relative scarcity of fundable enterprises in these zones. That should be fairly obvious to anyone who's sort of like thinking about this holistically. And in fact, that's one of the biggest challenges. So finding an enterprise to actually invest in. So we've had a couple of insights along the way, and we've started to look at things like restaurants, believe it or not, or restaurant groups. We've started to think about strategies wherein we might technologize successful food businesses. It could be restaurants, could be catering, whatever, and technologize them in a very specific way around creating products that can be sold via e-commerce. And that was a bit of an insight. We have started to look at co-working spaces that are already in existence within the opportunity zones that we're active in, primarily South LA. And knowing that by definition, the co-working space is going to meet that 50% revenue requirement. So, you know, what's interesting to me about all of this is that just the gap, the distance between what the letter of the law is and what the operational realities are. Lane, have you run across any writing or any thought leadership on this issue of like where the enterprise investing type insights are coming from?
No, I think but with, Garnet, one thing that's interesting about the provision of sort of local revenue and this discussion around, 50% of it having to be derived from the zone itself. What does that even really mean? I mean, you could unpack that a little bit. But one thing I'll say is that from the, sort of the more impact driven world, the folks that are, really focused on, the purity of intention and outcomes, and then on, a little bit more on just the more traditional private equity world. This is one thing everyone agrees on, that no one understands what any of this means. And I will say, from the less, what's the right term? From the less risk inclined, or from the less aspirational block of, leaders, again, investors or civic leaders, some folks just really don't want anything to do with this. Because back to this opposition credibility discussion, the truth is all in the details. And even though the opportunity zone provision, and you get into the weeds, didn't come from the Trump administration, it does roll up to the Trump tax cut. So there's still just some brand issues with the opportunity zones, I'll just say, and I'll leave it there. But I think this is a big one. I think, Garnet, back to your use case brainstorm, I do think some of your concepts, so, restaurant groups, co-working, entrepreneurial hubs, all seem directionally to be right on. I mean, one thing that I, personally, that I've seen some, one question is, so what investment model pre-opportunity zone provision has proven to work, is a way to sort of think about pipeline and opportunity zones.
That's a great way to think about it. Yeah.
And one I can share, I won't share the specifics. It's not something I'm directly involved with, but I've just anecdotally heard about is, there is sort of, I don't want to call it a burgeoning, but there are, in the sustainability world, there's a lot of excitement around, urban greenhouses. So there's a few startups that are building, greenhouses for high-end restaurants. So growing herbs, and other things that can be done pretty well hydroponically in, post-industrial.
Just to be clear, you used herbs plural, right? You're not talking about herb.
No, I'm actually talking about basil and chivril, and not marijuana. But that too could be a conversation. But again, that's going to cross over into this. Is that a sin business? Is that going to be, anyway, that's another issue with what's permissible. But no, I'm talking about,
how do you think about that? Is that it's the OZ, the Opportunity Zone legislation, considers that a sin business?
That's just right. But no, there's startups working in this, I'm just going to say high-end restaurant produce space.
Sure.
Where, they'll take over X acres of a former industrial lot, and they'll figure out a relatively cost-effective way to construct and scale up a greenhouse. And then, but then they're going to be selling that product. Well, who are we kidding? Not necessarily in that zip code, but that could be an excellent workforce development strategy. It could be a good land use strategy, and certainly would, with respect to the holding period and with respect to various, could certainly be set up as a real estate investment trust. And so, is that a relevant business opportunity that would align? I mean, I say yes, and also from a sustainability standpoint, but I don't know. I mean, so there's things like that from a use case thesis that are interesting.
Let's go down that rabbit hole a little bit, because that's worth expanding on just a little bit. So if no matter where you are in an underserved area, an inner city area, whatever, there's going to be one or more successful restaurant endeavors. It's just, it doesn't matter whether it's a fancy restaurant or more of a common man's restaurant. Restaurants, like funeral parlors, not to be too morbid, are typically a recipe for sort of first generation type entrepreneurial success. It's a model that a lot of, successive generations of immigrants in urban areas have used. So thinking about the role of urban, what are they calling it? There's a really cool name for this now, Lane, called, I think it's agritecture.
Yep.
Right. And it's a combination of agriculture and architecture done in these urban settings that service, restaurants within a fairly finite area. There's a hardware movement around it, meaning these self-contained growing things and, roof growing schema, all this kind of stuff. There's software for controlling, all of the inputs that go into this, so you can, do it on a large scale. So there's a whole sub-industry around this, right? That could be super successful in an opportunity zone. I could totally see that happening, because there's no conflict between where the money is being made and where the actual customers are. Because a lot of other models that are present, meaning entrepreneurial business models that are present in the opportunity zone on a legacy basis, the real conundrum is, what the hell is the IRS going to say about, let's just say, industrial company X? Because there are a fair number of like light manufacturing type industrial companies. And this is an actual example we ran across in South LA. Multi-million-dollar successful endeavor. They do something like specialty maintenance services for like high-tech, high-security type facilities. And I was like, great. Oh, man, what a fundable company. That's awesome. Then we dug into it a little bit more, and we realized that basically every single one of their clients is outside of the opportunity zone. And then my investment partners start, scratching their heads and wondering whether that means that the money is actually generated outside of the opportunity zone. Then the lawyer chimes in and says, you guys are going to get sued. I'm like, that pretty much ended that brainstorming session.
But that's I was thinking you had a slip of the tongue and said litigation, and it seems to me that maybe some of this will be defined, at the business end of some litigation.
You're right. You're absolutely right. And it's funny, right? I've had multiple Freudian slips about litigation legislation. Well, here it is, right? Intellectually, Mark's point is well taken. Intellectually, oftentimes exist on a spectrum. Right? You start with legislation and it's redefined by litigation, and then it becomes, better legislation or more operational, more actionable legislation. So there's definitely hopefully a virtuous cycle between legislation and litigation. So that maybe it's not so much of a Freudian slip. Maybe I'm just impatient for the outcome.
Yeah, but it seems that, especially in today's world, that's how things get defined. Legislation is often written in such a way that it's either incomplete or at the very best kind of left open, and it has to be defined by some kind of litigation.
I think that's right. I mean, I think that's why some of these like very prolific law writers stay in office that long, because there's a real art to that middle ground between trying to think through every single detail and leaving it vague enough so that the interplay between government and the private sector adds detail and inflection and relevance and timeliness to the whole thing, right?
Yeah. Yep.
What an exciting time we live in, and this opportunity zone concept and how it plays out. I mean, literally, Mark, could be an entire podcast series unto itself, don't you think?
Well, just because of the breadth of it, we talked when we first chatted about this a few weeks ago, we talked about looking at a map and seeing where all the opportunity zones are. And they're in communities, far and wide across this country. And talk about opportunity, just using that word, the opportunity is amazing for these places to have investment where they just haven't had it in decades.
And places, it may have unforeseen effects, and hopefully mostly positive effects based on some of the pervasiveness of that map. There's some odd things happening on that map, right? The entire state, I think it's a state. Now I'm showing my total civic ignorance of Puerto Rico is an opportunity zone.
Well, it's a commonwealth, I think, technically.
It's something like 95% of the land mass of Puerto Rico is actually in an opportunity zone. So, they've had a rough go of it recently, right? Between weather and financial crises and infrastructure crises, all this sort of stuff. So, maybe something significant will, some kind of significant economic rebirth will come out of it for Puerto Rico.
And that's, when you think about this as a piece of legislation as an initiative that private industry can get behind, that's kind of what you hope happens, right? Something good.
It's definitely what I hope for, and I'm pretty sure the originators of the legislation think about that. I know Lane thinks about that. He tried to build his entire career around that. I'm relatively late to the game. I've sort of come to this from the standpoint of I'm old, and the next phase of my career, I want to be more focused around things that are more of a win-win between investors and communities, and more of a win-win around sustainability and in every form, and versus just retiring and slowly degenerating.
Yeah, I think, Mark, I want to go back to something you said. If we're looking at, the state of the future with how opportunity zones will be leveraged for good, which is indeed the innovation of process.
Yeah.
So I think those of us who are aspirational or maybe naive enough to feel that, the sustainability or impact investing or corporate responsibility world can create transformational changes in how we allocate capital to make better social environmental decisions while growing financial value, are a little bit beaten up, because this concept has been around certainly in Europe a while, in the US a little bit more mainstream over the past 20 years. But indeed, I think innovation is an assumption like this, urban agriculture, offshore wind, port, smart tech, smart port, smart infrastructure. Name your concept, and I'm missing a lot of concepts that I think will become increasingly online. But I think the opportunity zone process is innovative in the sense that the legislation basically looks at social or investing decision-making in a different way. So the social sort of impact traditionally in America has been outsourced to the charitable world, which is 2% of GDP, almost over $400 billion goes to charities. But I think that, we all know we've got profound income inequality gaps in this country. And simply put, can you unleash market capital or simply just more capital to hopefully innovate? I think that's one huge assumption of the opportunity zone framework. And then can you do that across a portfolio? So as we've talked, what kind of businesses could be in that pool? And so I think, that's what's innovative and exciting. And it's certainly a mixture of, innovation driven by technology, but then also financial instrumentation, pipeline decisioning processes, research, more sort of analog skills that, you all have employed in your careers, and different stakeholders talking to people they don't traditionally talk to. I think that's what's potentially exciting. And I think that the folks that wrote this were imagining silo destruction in a way that could be unique and novel in terms of, this really being something that's transformational for America, but remains to be seen. But I'm cautiously optimistic. It's, Garnet, you and I, Garnet and I really connected, not necessarily simply for deal flow, but really because I think as an investor, Garnet, you kind of saw this fourth industrial revolution around sustainability, around brand being more and more important to be a part of early phase companies that you were looking at. So that gives me hope that this is becoming more mainstream.
So the way that we're framing and reframing this made me think of something that I hadn't thought about earlier. And this is not something I think we need to unpack here, Mark, but this could be a really cool topic for a future podcast. And it plays on multiple levels, because I'm super cynical about the US in general. One of the reasons I spend so much time on beaches outside of the States. There are other capitalist models around the world. In particular, the things that I've sort of admired from afar over the last, 30 years. So I will tell you, just by way of confession, that when I was an idealistic 20-something-year-old in college, and a little bit afterwards, it pretty much died with my 20s, my idealism. I wanted to be in the foreign service. I wanted to be a diplomat. So I spent a lot of time, at Columbia studying foreign economic models in particular. And just, as a lazy, progressively lazier citizen over the years, just read things and tried to stay abreast of developments. But in the last 50 years, there's been at least one other potent model, economic model, variation on capitalism that this sort of reminds me of, Lane. So I'm thinking of the Singapore capitalist model that has been reinterpreted in the last 20 years, let's call it, by communist China. So state capitalism was something that was written about extensively when Singapore had its first big wave of development. What was that, 80s, 90s? And it was championed by their leader / autocrat, Lee Kuan Yew. And basically, it was all about the government sets the macro goals, economic goals, this is, and then literally empowers very specific, in some cases partially state-owned, but mostly private organizations to go out and execute. And I see echoes of, and obviously that's gone to an extreme end with communist China now. It's promoted just tremendous amounts of growth for China over the last decade, for sure. Well, I would argue 20 years. But I actually see a lot of similarities between the potential outcomes from opportunity zones and how that is going to unfold operationally and this notion of state capitalism. So I'm going to leave it at that, because otherwise I'm going to start sounding too pedantic.
Yeah, I mean, so I think that I'll just simply respond. I think that certainly the American capital system is sort of admittedly under some stress right now. And I think what's particularly driving that is two quick things. One, I think, sort of rapid urbanization and rapid gentrification have made housing a real challenge for the workforce. I think the Singapore model is certainly interesting. And I do think going back to where the opportunity zone legislation falls sort of in a capital strategy, that does this get us closer to Singapore or China? I don't know, is a short answer. But I do think it's an opportunity to create more equitable capital, which, the proof will be in a decade or more. So it's an interesting question about the kind of capitalism we want to have in this country. And of course, the near constant clash between so-called European capitalism and American capitalism.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to watch, because it is in many ways a cultural conflict that some people in America don't want to see European capitalism with the kind of socialism mixed in, and others say, well, Germany is a pretty capitalistic country and has a lot of great enterprises that have been built there. So anyway, we could go on and on, couldn't we?
Yeah.
That's right.
Probably in the future, though, huh?
Yeah. This was a great discussion, Lane. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Thanks, Lane. Thanks, Mark.
All right, next time, Garnet and I have some fun. We chat with Daniel Ray about the innovation he heads up at Ultimate Guitar, an app for guitar players that I've used for a while. I'm not much of a guitar player, but it's a great app. So it'll be fun to learn about the innovation they've packed into their technology. We also have plans to talk with Mark Gallagher about innovation in the world of F1, Francesca Gino of Harvard Business School about how rebels can help a company embrace innovation, Kai Stinchcomb, founder of TrueLink Financial, about elder tech and his controversial views about blockchain. Lots more in store, so stay with us.
Thanks for joining Garnet and Mark on the Innovation Podcast. Visit innovationpodcast.co to subscribe and listen to other episodes.